Welcome to the recording of session 1 of the OPS Tanzu Office Lounge series focusing on Tanzu Mission Control. It's a solution that simplifies Kubernetes or container management by enabling developers to be more productive via self-service access to resources, while empowering operators to apply consistent security and management policies. I'm joined here today by Andrea Samuel, Senior Solution Engineer, and Keith Lee, Senior Technical Architect. I'm Lindsay Osaka, the Tanzu Account Executive for the Ontario Public Service, and we hope that you enjoy the following presentation.
Okay, so again, the focus today will be on VMware Tanzu Mission Control. And as Lindsay mentioned, this is part of the overall VMware Modern Apps business unit that we have. So really quickly wanted to go into where does this fit within our overall portfolio of Tanzu products. So when you think about VMware Tanzu, it's really a blend of what you've traditionally heard of VMware being like an infrastructure up play, but also an application down effort as well. So we concentrate and break it up into these 3 different buckets, primarily build, run, and manage. So the build portion is going to be like whether you run primarily Windows workloads or Java workloads. We leverage like Spring and Steel Toe to really build out native cloud native patterns and microservices, leveraging those tools and frameworks. The run piece, which is very critical for us, is our Kubernetes runtime and layer. And then on top of that, we have management across all of this, which is where in this like right-hand bucket, most of Tanzu Mission Control fits. And our goal really is how can we address multi-cloud, multi-cluster, and multiple applications. So really quickly going into this, Tanzu Mission Control is really central management across all of your Kubernetes infrastructure. We know that enterprises now, as they move to Kubernetes, they don't necessarily just rely on one provider. Many enterprises have on-prem offerings and also have public cloud that they leverage, whether that's AWS, Azure, GCP, etc. So understanding that there may be multiple Kubernetes clusters that exist, Tanzu Mission Controls meets you where you're at and provides consistent and standardized management across all of these clusters. So why containers and Kubernetes in the first place? So it has been a little bit of a hyped up term, but this is where industry is going towards containers. And the benefit that you get for this is for developers, containers and Kubernetes can help them ship code faster. Right? They can make changes to their application and push new features more quickly than they could before, especially with an automated pipeline that I think came up in the poll. On the other side of things, it's helpful for operators because there are consistent cloud-like operations, and you have a single layer of management across it. So you can avoid like shadow IT popping up while at the same time enabling your developers to have the self-provisioning capabilities that they want. More so, going forward, a lot of ISVs, the vendors are providing their applications through containers. So it's becoming increasingly essential to have a Kubernetes runtime and platform that can support that. And just statistically speaking, the expectation is that there are going to be over 500 million applications that reside in the Kubernetes landscape over the next 5 years. So you see just exponential growth that is happening in this space. And it's kind of like you can't ignore this if you haven't looked into it thus far. So as I mentioned a little bit earlier, so there is a fragmentation that's happening. And I said, you know, the fear of central IT is you don't want shadow IT popping up because that severely impacts your governance and security capabilities. So what we have here is you could have a variety of Kubernetes clusters that exist, like on Amazon Web Services, Azure, GCP, and even VMware vSphere, right? And maintaining and managing this can be very hard. The thing that we often talk about with clients is Kubernetes is interesting and fun, and it's fun to set up as a science project, kind of off in the corner. But when you're really thinking about scaling this and making it scalable and supportable across an enterprise, you need more management capabilities on top of it. So the benefit is, without something like Tanzu Mission Control, you have to apply access, networking, security policies on a cluster by cluster basis. And then you end up with cluster sprawl, and it just becomes a nightmare to manage. So just as we were talking, to increased operational burden leads to increased risks. So now doing a little bit of a deeper dive on what Tanzu Mission Control gives you. It's this idea, as we mentioned, of being multi-cloud, multi-cluster, and multi-team management. So from a productivity standpoint, the reason that Shadow IT happens is it's easy for developers to go to AWS, go to the management console, and spin up an EKS cluster and run containers there. The benefit that we want to give in Tanzu Mission Control is that same level of flexibility, but within more governance and security around it through a central management plane. There's also consistency. So regardless of what type of cluster you're running, whether that even be OpenShift or Azure, etc., you can attach those clusters and maintain similar policies across the board. And finally, from a security standpoint, you really want to have a solid policy engine and inspections. We leverage a lot of the open source tools and frameworks that exist. So like Sonabuoy for conformance and inspections are leveraged here as well. And so that allows us to keep very up to date with the community as well. So now I'll take a second to focus on the capabilities and functionality that is offered by TMC, and then Keith can also speak to other deeper dives on this slide. So things that we offer is cluster lifecycle management for TKG, Tanzu Kubernetes grid clusters on AWS. And we're quickly expanding this to provide that functionality on vSphere and Azure as well. And the benefit of this is you don't have to go to the individual like AWS console, et cetera, to provision clusters. You can do it almost like with a one-stop shop, one-click in the TMC management plane. The other features that we have are identity and access management. We can integrate to existing IAM policies that you already have through what we call federation. From a security and compliance standpoint, I kind of alluded to the conformance tests that we're able to run. And on top of that, we also have several policies that we'll get into in a second. From a data protection standpoint, we have integration with Valero that just recently came out. So you can do backup and data recovery of your clusters. So let me pause for a second. Went through a lot of items here. Anything that you guys want to probe into a little bit more deeply on this? And Keith, like, is there anything happening in the chat? I don't see it on my side.
Sorry, Andrea, I'm not seeing anything come through on the chat just yet. Okay.
Keith, do you want to speak any more to this piece and give more of your perspective here?
No, you're pretty much covering it very well. I'd be more interested in, I suppose, the audience. Like, again, feel free to speak, or if so, chat, because yeah, I can go down rabbit holes on any of these. I don't want to take up all the time on one specific.
Well, actually, Keith, if you don't mind, maybe you could point out some of the most common kind of areas that government customers kind of come to your team with, and then I know that I think there may be some interest from a roadmap perspective of where is Tanzu Mission Control going.
Yeah, sure. So the big attractive piece which Andrea touched on is the policy engine of Tanzu Mission Control. And to give it an example of creating a cluster, then applying all your configurations, your own personal policies, then doing it again. The power of Tanzu Mission Control with its policy engine is that there's some constructs, and one of those constructs is a cluster group. So for example, you could say I have a production cluster group, or I have a development cluster group. When you either attach or provision a cluster, one of the requirements are which cluster group will that belong to. And on that action of either attaching or creating, the policies configured against that cluster group are immediately applied to that cluster. So as soon as it's attached or as soon as it's created, those policies are applied. And for example, I think Andrea has a few examples coming up, like, for example, images. What registries are you allowing to be pulled in for that cluster group? Access policies, who can have access and what type of access? Network policies, what is allowed to talk to what? And again, security policies, what are you going to have a strict one? So you have a lot of control, but the beauty is it's not, you don't have to manage each cluster individually every time. It's as simple as attaching it or provisioning it and specifying which cluster group, and the rest is taken care of. So you know you have a consistent configuration. Every time you attach it to that, it matches that, and that's the power of the policy engine. And that's just one of the areas of TMC.
That's perfect. Thanks, Keith. And just going off of what Keith was saying, we have these two separate kind of hierarchies that we think about it. So as Keith was alluding to, there's this cluster group concept, which is the management across multiple clusters, anything you attach. And we also have this concept of workspaces. So at least in my head, one way that I think about the distinction is cluster groups can be taken as maybe you have different like business units within your org. But then workspaces, which map more closely to namespaces, if you think of native Kubernetes, that can be more like application-based and application-driven. One thing I do want to call out, though, is workspaces can be namespaces across multiple clusters, as you can see in this diagram. So for instance, a cluster group can consist of a vSphere cluster, an AWS cluster, and an Azure cluster. It can all be under one cluster group. And then you can also have the concept of workspaces, which is a namespace within one of each of those clusters can then also be grouped into a workspace. And as Keith mentioned, all of these access policies, et cetera, can be mapped accordingly. The image policy, I just wanted to spend a little bit more time on. So when you think of giving access to your developers to containers that may exist in Docker Hub, et cetera, right? You're exposing potentially your organization to vulnerabilities. On average, I think like open CVEs, which are critical vulnerabilities that exist within organizations, are about 6 years. So one thing that you can do with image policy is have a private registry like Harbor or Google private registry, and make sure that container images can only be pulled from those. So that's really a huge advantage that we have there. So I quickly wanted to touch on some of the personas that exist. And so really the two personas that we speak to when we think of Tanzu Mission Control is the operations team and then the application team, right? So from an operations team standpoint, you really have control of managing the Kubernetes clusters that you have across multiple clouds while giving developers self-service access. So you can manage cluster lifecycle management, you can upgrade clusters when it makes sense, et cetera. This kind of helps you versus going into maybe like an EKS offering where after a certain period of time it forces you to upgrade clusters. So that is a benefit that you get leveraging us with our Tanzu Kubernetes grid. And then through Tanzu Mission Control, you also have a dashboard view where you can see all of the clusters that are relevant to your organization, and you can see the status of it. So from a compliance and audit perspective, this is extremely useful and helpful. Keith, would you mind going into this slide a little bit of how we make the distinction between attaching clusters versus like our concept of provisioning and having the local control management plane?
Sure, yeah. So one of technologies with Kubernetes is Cluster API. And with Cluster API, it's high level Kubernetes managing Kubernetes. So that's why you have a concept of a management cluster, which can then provision what's known as workload clusters. So when we say TMC can provision clusters, is that the TMC has the management cluster and it's provisioning the workload clusters. Today, that's on AWS, and very shortly, that will be also, TMC will have the ability to provision workload clusters on premise with vSphere. That's provisioning. So again, you can do what we kind of call plans or templates. You have what other providers would be a development cluster, typically has one control plane and as many workers as you wish. And then with what could be deemed as a production plan or a template would be a highly available control plane, and again, as many workers as well. And with that, you can specify, as it's AWS today, what regions and zones they are in. The attach is, you can attach any conformant, Kubernetes conformant cluster to TMC. And it is simple as literally one command. Where what the attach process is an agent is installed on the cluster. A lightweight agent is installed on the cluster, and that communicates back to TMC, the SaaS offering. There's no, all the communication is from TMC, sorry, from the agent back to TMC. There's no communication inwards. So it's polling TMC regularly, what policies have been set in TMC and I need to apply on my cluster. So that's the attach process. And there's no feature disparity between attached and provisioned. You have the full feature set of TMC. So all those policies, data protection, and all upcoming features are all for attached and provisioned. And that's at quite high level.
Perfect. Thank you, Keith. So I know back in the poll, you guys did have some questions in terms of how this would work. And I just wanted to highlight really quickly that the capability to leverage Tanzu Mission Control exists across like the UI API, as well as we have a TMC CLI. So all of this can be done through the command line as well, which makes it much more easier to integrate into existing automation pipelines that you may have. So then I kind of wanted to also give one other perspective of Tanzu Mission Control that often people might not think about, but it's actually becoming a very frequently used use case. And that is the idea of Kubernetes deployment at the edge. I don't know how many edge deployments you guys might have within your ministries, but the whole idea being you can have like disparate across different regions Kubernetes clusters that exist, and then Tanzu Mission Control can be kind of your like central management plane across all of that. So an easy to reference example of that could be retail stores where you have say Kroger, etc., where they have multiple stores, and so they could have each of like a Kubernetes deployment at the store level, and then Tanzu Mission Control can be your centralized platform to manage all of those deployments. So we'll just wrap up with this kind of final slide on the benefits that you get from Tanzu Mission Control. Really, it's to drive increased developer agility and productivity, and provide that self-service provisioning with the necessary security and governance mandates in place. You get the operational efficiency and governance that needs to be there as well. Also, it reduces the learning curve of operators who are getting ramped on Kubernetes, so that it's not super overwhelming. It's a straightforward and easy to use graphical user interface that they can leverage. And then it also enhances security and compliance with ongoing policies that are being developed and are extremely relevant, all to ultimately like accelerate your business transformation. So I do see some things that might be popping up in chat, or Keith posted some links in recent webinars that may be good reference points. that being said, maybe Lindsay, I will hand it back to you.
So in summary, Tanzu Mission Control is a centralized management platform for securing and managing your Kubernetes infrastructure across any mix of teams, clouds, ministries. It's backend agnostic. So as a next step, please feel free to reach out to myself, Andrea, or Keith if you're interested in a more in-depth conversation or a solution demo. Thanks, and we'll talk to you soon.